Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on my newest system. It's only 20 days old at this point. When the worms were put in here 20 days ago, it was only a partial extraction of the worms that came out of their old system. So I'm expecting to add more worms to this population. Even though it's a pretty well populated system, I've still got some more worms that I want to bring into here. And it's been 10 days since we last fed this system too, so besides hopefully adding some more worms to this system today, we're going to throw in their next feeding. 10 days ago we came in here, and at that time all we really did was check out the material that these worms that live in here, the material from which we removed them. So like the newest stuff is all the way over here, the oldest stuff is all the way over here. We actually took the material that these worms had been living in and we moved it into this bag in the hopes that it might help the stuff dry, because it was just so damp that it was the dampness of the material that I attributed the slow migration of the worms out of the material to. So when we were in here last time, 10 days ago, we did aerate the material, but I've not been in here since, other than 3 days later, 1 week ago. I actually came in here with my little bait boxes, and I did actually try to restart the migration of the worms out of here. For some time now, they've just been, sitting in this material, letting the material dry. And a week ago, I figured, why don't we see what we could do about getting the worms to start moving out of here. So we're going to see how the depopulation's happening. Do a haul out, I believe. We'll see. And then we'll make our way over to the new system where we'll release the collected worms, get the system fed, have a little bit of a family reunion. So I'm going to put on a glove and we're going to get to work. So here in the Vermibag tote, as I mentioned earlier, I set up my bait boxes. My bait boxes are really just a couple of these canisters in which you put a pond pump filter. So these two canisters attached to a little T, and then inside each of these is like a filter. But since they've got these nice openings on the side, all these slots, I've been using these things as bait boxes, especially since my pond is no longer functioning since the pump broke. So here was my game plan. My game plan was to only extract these if we found that the depopulation of their castings appeared to have worked, and to a high degree. So if we still find worms in here, I believe we're just going to pull away from the whole idea of extracting these bait boxes and permit a little bit more time for the depopulation of the material to continue and complete. Hopefully at this point it looks like we're still dealing with material chock full of worms. A little bit surprising considering how it is starting to become quite dry, but maybe it's just dry on the surface. I guess down low where I'm bumping into all the worms, that's where the moisture probably still remains at a fairly high concentration. So I guess that means today we will not be pulling out these bait boxes. I guess one thing we might be able to do is put a little twist on how this was set up. Instead of trying to migrate them to this far edge of the container all the way over here, since there's slots on this side as well as slots on this side, perhaps we can just place it right smack in the middle, and then this way worms coming from either direction have the potential of bumping into these bait boxes and venturing into them. So I soaked the material, I added some bedding down low, I added some food, and then I put some newspaper on top to serve as a little bit of a cap to help keep the moisture in. And then the plastic covering you saw in the very beginning that I removed, that also is there to try to keep the material in here nice and damp. So I guess the one thing we will do, besides what we just completed, which is the aeration of the material and stirring it around, we'll just reposition these little bait stations smack in the middle, and then hopefully worms will make their way into these things, find that they bumped into a spot where the material's still nice and damp and comfortable, and then they'll stay inside those things. So I'm just curious to take a peek, make sure the moisture level is still quite high. It does seem to be. I mean, I just touched this stuff and it's still damp. So let's leave it at that. I don't want to get too fancy with this thing. I just started into this with the high hopes of maybe coming in here to find that the material had in fact been depopulated already, but regrettably it's still pretty loaded with worms that still need some time to venture out of this stuff over into the bait boxes. Hopefully we'll be able to do a haul out, the final haul out, at some point soon. I mean, if we were to examine what's going on inside these bait boxes, we might find some worms. I really don't even know what to expect as far as what's going on inside these boxes, but hopefully by stirring all the stuff that was out on the surface, left to dry, down into the more damp material down low, we've hopefully caused a further drop in the overall moisture content of everything that's in here. Specifically the stuff that's still pretty damp and holding on to its moisture. Hopefully by getting blended in with so much dry stuff that was out on the surface, we're going to kind of give these worms a quick shock of somewhat drier surroundings, hopefully triggering their movement, and hopefully they'll start bumping into what we set out here for them, this little bait station. And back on goes the covering, which is really there to help prevent the loss of any moisture to evaporation. And it is kind of nice to see how the stuff inside those little boxes is holding up as far as still being quite damp. So that's that. I was kind of keeping my fingers crossed, hoping that we'd be able to do our final haul out here today, but it'll just have to wait until next time. So it'll simply be a feeding of our newest worm bin. So let me get this out of the way, and we'll proceed to giving the worms over in the new bin their nice, generous portion. Look at all that stuff. Even corn cobs. Corn cobs are back on the menu again. It's summertime. So let me get them out here and we'll treat them to this delicious bounty of foods. So the feeding these guys got 10 days ago was delivered in little bundles, little wrapped up care packages of food. I think I just had a whole bunch of napkins that had to go. So I used those as little wraps to put the food into. There may have been 3 or 4 of them, I believe. And I have something similar going on today. I've got a bunch of paper towels and napkins and stuff that needs to be done away with. So I thought that we could take their foods, once again, bundle them into these little care packages. And then in a way we will have been not only taking care of the feeding, but also at the same time delivering their food with a little bit of a boost to their bedding supply. Although, you know, a pretty new system like this, 20 days old, not even 3 weeks old yet, as you can see, is loaded with tons and tons of available bedding still. So there's no shortage of bedding in these newer systems. It's when you get into the older systems where it starts to seem like they're working away all their available bedding, and as a result, you know, limiting their availability of a food source like their bedding, which is much more high in carbon content as opposed to the food, the kitchen type scraps that are a little bit more high in nitrogen content. So there's that whole concept in composting where you try to keep a balance between the carbon and the nitrogen, kind of the browns and the greens sort of thinking. So the bedding in the bin is kind of the browns, and the kitchen scraps are kind of the greens. So the plastic covering did leave certain stuff out here on the edges quite dry, and I like to try to blend in that stuff that was left dry since the last check-in, in the hopes that it can catch up on being broken down, because being dry it just receives no worm traffic at all. So we'll see about combining some of this stuff in with some of the more damp stuff that's down low. And this is one of the few systems remaining in my wormery that still have plastic coverings. I've been gradually transitioning from plastic coverings to either just no coverings at all, or combinations of paper and or cardboard. It's been very humid, so I don't worry too much this time of year about my systems losing a lot of moisture to evaporation. In fact, sometimes it even goes in the opposite direction where the systems just get overly damp. So I'm trying to prevent that from happening. Although in a system like this, it really wouldn't matter how wet things got because of the abundance of bedding. It's in the older systems where it's a lot of castings already, where the excess moisture causes things to get muddy and clumpy and a little bit nasty. In a system like this, there's really no concern as far as the potential of going overboard on moisture, I believe. I mean, I don't want to be literal in that statement either. There's always too much, but it's of little concern in a system like this. So I just kind of went out to the outer edges and used the material down low to blend in all that dry stuff we found on the edges. Now we can make our way into the middle, which is where I would have laid in the feeding. I don't have any coffee for them today, only those veggies from the freezer. But I do have a coffee filter, so when we're done, we could treat these little guys to having a coffee filter resting right over where we last fed. I like to include feeding zone indicators. Is this thing still trying to grow? I threw in some pieces of Brussels sprout. Not last feeding, but 2 feedings ago. But last time we did notice how some of these were still attempting to sprout. And it did almost look to me like a couple of these little things shooting out of the side of this were the Brussels sprout still trying to grow. But hardly anymore. It's really having a tough time anymore. So when stuff is still kind of alive and attempting to grow, the worms leave it alone. They don't mess with stuff that's alive. They only have interest in stuff that's in the process of decomposing and breaking down. So here is where the worms are all hanging out, clearly, down in the feeding zone. Look at them all. All right. Lots and lots of worms here to greet us. I was even thinking maybe maybe those top covering newspapers that were out here could potentially go in as a little bit of supplemental bedding too. Although I do like to see if I can get a maximum number of uses out of those things. So maybe if they're still intact enough, we'll see about maybe keeping them around for one more go and using them as top covering papers one last time. But I've got a feeling it might be their last hurrah. They'll probably be used as bedding in the next check-in. Sometimes I try to see if I can recognize what I'm finding as far as leftovers goes. This definitely looks like the skin of some watermelon. And it's funny because if it was just the skin, it would be like a piece of paper and it would be very floppy. It would just, you know, here we go. It's even delaminating. But I guess my point is that it still has some of the melon attached to that piece of skin right there. That's pretty surprising. Here's some newspaper, it looks like. Here and there we're bumping into little bits of leftovers, but certainly not much. So let's see about opening up this feeding zone so we could begin positioning their meal down into here for them. Oh my goodness, look at all these worms. Yeah, we've got a pretty good sized population living down here in this system. Right, let's let these little guys settle and then we'll come in here with their feeding. Alright, so we've left a couple minutes for that action to wind down. So I think we're ready to get to the grand finale here of giving these guys their delicious assortment of foods. Just get these leftovers we bumped into back down into the feeding area. And then we'll set the feeding up very similar to the way we did last time. We just created these little pockets into which we started piling in the food. And we got a good amount of food here for them today. Corn coming back into the picture, covered in pieces of lettuce, pieces of strawberry, pieces of peel off of cucumber. We've got a couple more of these, I believe, at least 2 or 3. Let's put the next one in right here. I think by putting the food right into these pieces of paper, the paper is almost certain to just get gobbled up 1, 2, 3. This is pretty thick. It feels like maybe more than one piece. Yeah, it's 2 pieces. Let's divvy it up consistently with each portion of food. It does seem like, oh, look at that big juicy piece of cucumber. That thing almost deserves an entire piece of paper towel on its own. And then what remains, I believe, can fit neatly into the final piece over here. Everything's kind of getting juicy and damp as it starts to melt, because everything's getting put in here after being first frozen, which I believe really contributes greatly to the sped up breakdown of the materials. After they've frozen and they begin to thaw, everything just has a tendency to become kind of mushy, as you probably know already if you've ever taken something out of the freezer. It just gets all mushy. And then let's see, I've even got this other piece of paper towel over here. It was just sitting out on my bench. It's been out here for some time now. Maybe we can use it as sort of a top covering. But before we do that, I'm going to coat this delicious portion of food with some pulverized eggshell. This doesn't really classify so much as food as much as it is more a grit source for the worms to help them aid in the digestion of the yummy foods that they've been given. And that makes it official. Feeding number 2 going in on day 20. Another pretty generous feeding from what I remember. I think the last feeding was fairly generous as well. And now we could start piling in the wormies. Here's a little bundle of worms that we're probably still working on. A piece of food or something that's stuck in the middle. I could feel something a little squishy there, whatever that was. Sometimes I wonder if it's really food that they're all jazzed about, or is it just a pocket of moisture? In most cases, the pocket of moisture is there because it's some sort of a food item that's still breaking down. And here too, little jumbles of worms gathered together, but they're probably gathered together because of us having extracted them out of the feeding zone and then all retreating due to the bright lights overhead. So now in can come the feeding zone indicator. Let's just make sure we've succeeded in evicting all of these worms off of my gloves before we lose track of the fact that we might have some stuck to us still. Here's our feeding zone indicator, and like I said, we're going to see about restoring these top covering newspaper bits to their former job. And I believe that the next time we see these pieces of paper, they're going to be getting upgraded to no longer be top covering paper. They're going to be promoted and they're going to be given the much more important job of being bedding to go hand in hand with the feeding these guys get next time. So there we go, a little bit all over the place with these top covering newspapers. I just like to have something there beneath the plastic coverings so that the worms can kind of come out there and play on this stuff, because the moisture in the bin, as it tries to escape through evaporation, gets caught on the plastic here, sort of like a terrarium. If you've ever seen a terrarium, the moisture condenses on the surface since it's unable to escape into the atmosphere, and then it shows up as little water droplets, and the worms really enjoy that. So the top surface is usually a pretty popular place for the worms. So that's it for our feeding today. Red Wigglers, 20-day-old bin, feeding number 2. I think we've covered all that already. So that's the end of the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Everyone have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.